Order. Statement, the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I would like to make a statement on today's report from Lord Justice Leveson. As we consider this report, we should consider the victims. We should remember how the parents of Miliband, at their most vulnerable moment, had their daughter's phone hacked and were followed and photographed. How Christopher Jeffrey's reputation was destroyed by false accusations. And how the mother of Madeleine McCann, Kate, had her private diary printed without her permission, and how she and her husband were falsely accused of keeping their daughter's body in the freezer. These victims, and many other innocent people who have never sought the limelight, have suffered in a way that we can barely begin to imagine. That is why last summer I asked Lord Justice Leveson to lead an independent inquiry. It had the power to see any document and summon any witness under oath to be examined by a barrister in public. It has been, as Lord Justice Leveson says, the most public and the most concentrated look at the press that this country has seen. And I'd like to thank Lord Justice Leveson and his entire team for the work that they've undertaken. Mr. Speaker, Lord Justice Leveson makes findings and recommendations in 3 areas: on the relationship between the press and the police, on the relationship between the press and politicians, and on the relationship between the press and the public. Let me take each in turn. First, the press and the police. Lord Justice Leveson makes clear that he doesn't find a basis for challenging the integrity of the police, but he does raise a number of areas which he felt were a cause for public concern, such as tip-offs, off-the-record briefings, and more broadly, excessive proximity between the press and the police. He makes a number of recommendations, including national guidance on appropriate gifts and hospitality, record keeping of contact between very senior police officers and journalists, and a 12-month cooling-off period for senior police officers being employed by the press. These are designed to break the perception of an excessively cosy relationship between the press and the police, and we support these recommendations. Mr. Speaker, when I set up this inquiry, I also said there would be a second part to investigate wrongdoing in the press and the police, including the conduct of the first police investigation. This second stage cannot go ahead until the current criminal proceedings have concluded, but we remain committed to the inquiry as it was first established. Next, the relationship between the politicians and the media. As Lord Justice Leveson has found, over the last 30 to 35 years, and probably much longer, the political parties of UK national government and UK official opposition have had or developed too close a relationship with the press in a way that has not been in the public interest. I made this point last summer when I set up this inquiry, and at the same time I set in train reforms to improve transparency. This is the first government ever to publish details of meetings between senior politicians and proprietors, editors or senior executives, as Lord Justice Leveson recommends in his report. He also recommends disclosing further information on the overall level of interaction between politicians and press. This would apply to all parties, and on the government's behalf, I can say that we accept the recommendation. Now, Mr. Speaker, during the course of this inquiry, a number of serious allegations were made, and I want to deal with them directly. First, that my party struck a deal with News International. This is an allegation that was repeated again and again on the floor of this House and at the inquiry itself. Lord Justice Leveson looked at this in detail and rejects the allegation emphatically. Let me read his conclusion, and I quote, "The evidence does not, of course, establish anything resembling a deal whereby News International's support was traded for the expectation of policy favours. Those who repeatedly made these allegations, including members of this House, and I have to say the former Prime Minister, should now acknowledge they were wrong." Second, it was alleged that I gave my right honourable friend, the then Culture Secretary, now the Health Secretary, the responsibility of handling the B-Sky bid in order to fix the outcome. Lord Justice Leveson states clearly, and I quote, "The evidence does not begin to support the conclusion that the choice of Mr. Hunt was the product of improper media pressure, still less an attempt to guarantee a particular outcome to the process." Another allegation repeatedly made and again shown to be wrong. Third, there was the criticism that the then Culture Secretary had rigged the handling of the B-Sky B bid. Again, today's report rejects that as well. My right honourable friend, it says, put in place robust systems to ensure that the remaining stages of the bid would be handled with fairness, impartiality and transparency. Indeed, Lord Justice Leveson goes further, concluding that my right honourable friends, and I quote, extensive reliance on external advice was a wise and effective means of helping him to keep to the statutory test. And he concludes there is no credible evidence of actual bias. Of course, as my right honourable friend has said, there are lessons to learn about how quasi-judicial decisions are made, and we must learn those lessons. But let me say this, my right honourable friend, now the Health Secretary, has endured a stream of allegations with great dignity. This report confirms that we on this side of the House knew all along we were right to stand by him. Let me also say this, Lord Justice Leveson finds in respect to my right honourable friend the Business Secretary, and I quote, that he acted with scrupulous care and impartiality. Next, and most important of all, let me turn to what Lord Justice Leveson says about the relationship between the press and the public. As he says very clearly, even after 16 months of this inquiry, he remains, and I quote, firmly of the belief that the British press, all of it, serves the country very well for the vast majority of the time. But on the culture, practices and ethics of some in the press, his words are very stark. He finds that there have been too many times when chasing the story, parts of the press have acted as if its own code, which it wrote, simply did not exist. He cites press behaviour that at times can only be described as outrageous. He catalogues a number of examples of such behaviour, going wider than phone hacking. He refers to, and I quote, a recklessness in prioritising sensational stories, almost irrespective of the harm that the stories may cause and the rights of those who would be affected. He finds that when the story is just too big and the public appetite too great, there has been significant and reckless disregard for accuracy. And he reports a cultural tendency within parts of the press vigorously to resist or dismiss complainants almost as a matter of course. Mr. Speaker, in a free society, the press are subject to criminal law, civil law, and requirements for data protection. But there should be a proper regulatory system as well to ensure that standards are upheld, complaints are heard, and there is a proper redress for those who have been wronged. That is what the current system should have delivered. It has not. And as Lord Justice Leveson says, the Press Complaints Commission is, and I quote, neither a regulator nor fit for purpose to fulfil that responsibility. And that is why changes are urgently needed. Mr. Speaker, we welcome the fact that the press industry themselves have put forward their own proposals for a new system of regulation. But we agree with Lord Justice Leveson that these proposals do not yet go far enough. Mr. Speaker, in Volume 4 of the report, Lord Justice Leveson sets out proposals for independent self-regulation organised by the media. He details the key requirements that an independent self-regulatory body should meet, including independence of appointments and funding, a standards code, an arbitration service, and a speedy complaint handling mechanism. Crucially, it must have the power to demand upfront prominent apologies and impose up to £1 million fines. These are the Leveson principles. They are the central recommendations of the report. If they can be put in place, we truly will have a regulatory system that delivers public confidence, justice for the victims, and a step change in the way the press is regulated in our country. I accept these principles, and I hope the whole House will come in behind them. And the onus should now be on the press to implement them, and implement them radically. Now, in support of this, Lord Justice Leveson makes some important proposals. First, he proposes some changes to the Data Protection Act that would reduce the special treatment that journalists are afforded when dealing with personal data. We must consider this very carefully, particularly the impact this could have on investigative journalism. While I've only been able to make preliminary investigations about this since reading the report, I am instinctively concerned about this proposal. Second, he proposes changes to establish a system of incentives for each newspaper to take part in the system of independent regulation. I agree there should be incentives and believes that those ones that he sets out, such as the award of costs and exemplary damages in litigation, could be effective. He goes on to propose legislation that would help deliver those incentives, but also that would, crucially, provide, and I quote, an independent process to recognise the new self-regulatory body. This would, he says, reassure the public that the basic requirements of independence and effectiveness were met and would continue to be met. Now, I have some serious concerns and misgivings on this recommendation. They break down into issues of principle, practicality and necessity. The issue of principle is that for the first time we would have crossed the Rubicon of writing elements of press regulation into the law of the land. We should, I believe, be wary of any legislation that has the potential to infringe free speech and a free press. In this House, which has been a bulwark of democracy for centuries, we should think very, very carefully before crossing this line. On the grounds of practicality, no matter how simple the intention of the new law, the legislation required to underpin the regulatory body would, I believe, become more complicated. Paragraph 71 and 72 in the executive summary begin to set out what will be needed in the legislation. It refers to, for instance, validating the standards code and recognising the powers of the new body, for example. And if you turn to page 1772 in volume 4 of the full report, it says this about the new law. It must, and I quote, identify those legitimate requirements and provide a mechanism to recognise and certify that a new body meets them. The danger is this would create a vehicle for politicians, whether today or sometime in the future, to impose regulation and obligations on the press, something that Lord Justice Leveson himself wishes to avoid. Third, on the grounds of necessity, I'm not convinced at this stage that statute is necessary to achieve Lord Justice Leveson's objectives. I believe there may be alternative options for putting in place incentives, providing reassurance to the public, and ensuring the Leveson principles of regulation are put in place, and these options should be explored. Mr. Speaker, these questions, including those about data protection, are fundamental questions we must resolve. I've therefore invited the Deputy Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition to join me in cross-party talks, starting immediately after this statement. But let me be clear, a regulatory system that complies with the Leveson principles should be put in place rapidly. I favour giving the press a limited period of time in which to do this. They do not need to wait for all the other elements of Lord Justice Leveson's report to be implemented. While no one wants to see full statutory regulation, let me stress the status quo is not an option. Be in no doubt, we should be determined to see Lord Justice Leveson's principles implemented. Mr. Speaker, there is much that we in this country can be proud of. The oldest democracy in the world, the freedom of speech, a free press, frank and healthy public debate. But this report lays bare that the system of press regulation we have is badly broken, and it has let down victims badly. Our responsibility is to fix this. The task for us now is to build this new system of press regulation that supports our great traditions of investigative journalism and of free speech, but that protects the rights of the vulnerable and the innocent and commands the confidence of the whole country. And I commend this statement to the House.
Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, can I start by thanking the Prime Minister for his statement? And can I say straight away that in the days and weeks ahead, I will be seeking to convince him and this House of Commons that we should put our faith in the recommendations of Lord Justice Leveson that were delivered to us today. I'm sorry the Prime Minister is not yet there, but I hope to convince him over the days ahead that that is where we should go. We should put our trust in Lord Justice Leveson's recommendations. Let me begin, Mr. Speaker, by paying tribute and thanking Lord Justice Leveson and his team for the painstaking, impartial and comprehensive way they have conducted this inquiry. And I thank Lord Justice Leveson for the clarity with which he has explained his report today. Most of all, though, I want to join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to the innocent victims who gave evidence to their inquiry. People who did not seek to be in the public eye, who suffered deep loss and grief, and then faced further trauma at the hands of the press. Bob and Sally Dowler. Mr. Speaker, it is easy to forget now, but without the revelations last July about what happened to them and to their daughter, and their courage in speaking out, we would simply not be here today. Jerry and Kate Mccann, who suffered so much and showed so much courage. Kate Mccann, whose daughter remains missing, and who saw her private diary published by the News of the World for the sake of a story. Mr. Speaker, they gave evidence to the inquiry to serve the wider public interest, and I'm sure the whole House pays tribute to their courage. Amen. And it is they who must be at the forefront of our minds today. Mr. Speaker, much has been written about the reasons for this inquiry. A free press is essential to a functioning democracy. The press must be able to hold the powerful especially us politicians, to account without fear or favour. That is part of the character of our country. But at the same time, I do not want to live in a country where innocent families like the Mccanns and the Dowlers can see their lives torn apart simply for the sake of profit. And where powerful interests in the press know they won't be held to account. This is about the character of our country. And Mr. Speaker, it turns out there never was just one rogue reporter. Lord Justice Leveson concludes that a whole range of practices, from phone hacking to covert surveillance to harassment to other wrongful behaviour, were widespread, all in breach of the code by which the press was supposed to abide. Now, I recognise the many decent people who work in our country's newspapers, and not every newspaper did wrong. But Lord Justice Leveson concludes, and I quote, "It is argued these are aberrations and do not reflect the culture, practices or ethics of the press as a whole." He says, "I wholly reject this analysis." Now, this will not come as a surprise to many people, including in this House. But as Lord Justice Leveson also concludes, there has been a persistent failure by politicians to respond to public concern about the culture, practices and ethics of the press. Mr. Speaker, we must all take our responsibility for that. And the publication of this report is the moment when we must put that right, upholding the freedom of the press and guaranteeing protection and redress for the citizen. As the Prime Minister himself rightly said at the Leveson inquiry, if the families like the Dowlers feel this has really changed the way they would have been treated, we would have done our job properly. Well, I agree. Let us be clear, Mr. Speaker, about Lord Justice Leveson's proposals and why they are different from the present system and why I believe they should be accepted in their entirety. He proposes what he calls a genuinely independent regulator with effective powers to protect and provide redress for the victims of abuse. But he also gives the responsibility for establishing that system to the press, as now. That's why statute is important, because he provides a crucial new guarantee which we've never had before. He recommends that the media regulator Ofcom ensures that the system that is established passes the test that we would all want applied, that it is truly independent and provides effective protection for people like the Mccanns and the Dowlers. And to make this guarantee real, he recommends that both Ofcom's role and these criteria of independence and effectiveness will be set out in statute, a law of this Parliament. That's why we can get to a truly independent regulation of the press guaranteed by law. I believe Lord Justice Leveson's proposals are measured, reasonable and proportionate. We on this side unequivocally endorse both the principles set out and his central recommendations. We support Lord Justice Leveson's view that Ofcom is the right body to carry out the task of recognition of the new regulator. We support his proposal that the House should lay down in statute the role of Ofcom. And we endorse Lord Justice Leveson's proposal that the criteria any new regulatory body must meet should be set out in statute. Without that, there cannot be the change we need. And Lord Justice Leveson is 100% clear about that in his report. Mr. Speaker, let me just say this. Lord Justice Leveson has, I believe, made every effort to meet the concerns of the industry. Now, there'll be some people who say this report does not go far enough, frankly. They will say it won't work because the press won't cooperate. I believe that the press, therefore, has a major responsibility to come forward and show they will cooperate with this system, a comprehensive reform of the kind that Lord Justice Leveson proposes. He also says, Mr. Speaker, that if we cannot achieve a comprehensive system involving all major newspapers, then we should go to the necessary alternative, which is direct statutory regulation. I believe that Lord Justice Leveson has genuinely listened to what the press have said. He has acted with the utmost responsibility, and editors and proprietors should now do the same. Let me also say, because the Prime Minister didn't touch on this, that Lord Justice Leveson also reaches important conclusions on the need to prevent too much influence in the media ending up in one pair of hands. He proposes there should be a continuous scrutiny of the degree of media plurality and a lower cap than that currently provided by competition law. Will the Prime Minister, when he gets up to reply, take this forward? Lord Justice Leveson, as the Prime Minister also says, makes specific suggestions about greater transparency about meetings and contacts between politicians and the press. He says they should be considered as an immediate need, I agree and I endorse the proposals, as indeed the Prime Minister did earlier on. Mr. Speaker, let me say I welcome the Prime Minister's offer of immediate cross-party talks on the implementation of these recommendations, and I'm grateful for the conversations that we've already had. But let me say to him, these talks must be about implementing these recommendations, not whether we implement them. I want these talks to agree a swift timetable for implementation of the proposals, agree to legislate in the next session of Parliament, starting in May 2013, with a new system up and running by the end of this Parliament, i.e. at the latest 2015. And Mr. Speaker, by the end of January of next year, we should have an opportunity, and we will make this happen if necessary, for the whole House to endorse and proceed with the Leveson proposals. I believe, Mr. Speaker, we should and we can move forward together, wholeheartedly now. We've had 70 years, 7 reports, which have gone nowhere. Now is the time to act. 20 years ago, let me remind the House of what David Waddington, then the Home Secretary, said 20 years ago. This is positively the last chance for the industry to establish an effective non-statutory system of regulation. Mr. Speaker, the case is compelling. The evidence is overwhelming. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make change the public can trust. There can be no more last-chance saloons. And in acting, let us remember the words of Bob and Sally Dowler at Leveson. There is nothing that can rectify the damage that has been done to our family. All we can hope for is a positive outcome from this inquiry so that other families are not affected in the way we have been. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of every decent British citizen who wants protection for people like the Dowlers, who wants a truly free press, a press that can expose abuse of power without abusing its own, we must act.
Can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his response? First, I think he's absolutely right to thank Leveson for the work that he's done and the report he's produced. He's absolutely right to talk about the innocent victims and the enormous courage that they've shown by appearing in front of this inquiry and telling their stories. And I think he's also right to mention Leveson's finding that all politicians, going back over decades, must take responsibility for a relationship between politicians and the press that got too close. Let me just make a couple of points on some of the things he said. I note that he said he did strongly support Ofcom carrying out the test of whether the regulatory system was compliant. I think this is something we need to look at in the cross-party discussions because, of course, it is very important that we demonstrate, however we go about this, the real independence of this regulatory system. And, of course, Ofcom, the chair is appointed by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State. We have to think about that. And I also think we have to consider Ofcom is already a very powerful regulatory body, and we should be trying to reduce concentrations of power rather than increase them. So I think this is something we might want to discuss. One issue that he didn't address, but again I hope we can address in the cross-party conversations, is this issue of the data protection law changes. I do think we have to, and we shouldn't respond in too rapid a way to something as complex as this. We do not want to put in place something that wrecks proper investigative journalism in our country. On the issue of statutory regulation, I would make the point to him that Leveson, I think rightly, rejects statutory regulation and says that we must move from the status quo. We must implement the principles of this report. I agree. That is absolutely vital. We don't want to be left in the position of only having statutory regulation as the alternative to the proposals that he sets out. I completely agree with him. The talks should be businesslike. We should get on with them. But where I would disagree, we don't have to wait to implement this report until those discussions are had. This report needs to be implemented by the press taking the steps set out in this report to put in place the independent regulation that Leveson speaks about. They could start that right now. Yeah.